Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Eric Siron back on the show, and we're going to be talking about our recent May 2024 monthly threat review. So again, this is one of our monthly threat review episodes, and in these episodes, we talk about our usual email security statistics, but we're also going to dive into some current news stories like Microsoft senior leadership announcing that they are going to officially take the recent security issues seriously. We're going to talk about the new PSTI Act that was recently passed as law in the UK. So that's a law that focuses on security best practices for consumer devices and consumer IoT devices. And we're also going to provide an update on what's going on with Change Healthcare. So that and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Sirwich, and I've got one of our regular co-hosts on the show today. I got Eric Siron. How's it going, Eric?
Doing well. How are you doing, Andy?
Doing good. Hey, Eric, we've got you back for another monthly threat review episode. And for those listeners that may not be familiar with what this episode is, every month here at Hornetsecurity, we do a written report called the monthly threat review, where we look at a bunch of email security statistics. These statistics are pulled from a lot of our security services here at Hornetsecurity, and it really allows us to get some good insight as to where the industry is in terms of email security. So we're going to share some of those statistics today. And also as part of this report, every month we look at what's happening in the cybersecurity news space. So for example, this month we are going to spend some time talking about the Microsoft security situation that's going on. We've talked about that extensively on this show. We've done episodes on the Storm 0558 breach. We've talked about the Midnight Blizzard incident, which is where Russian nation state threat actors exfiltrated Microsoft executive emails. We've talked about a lot of those Microsoft incidents, and, well, we finally heard some information straight from Satya Nadella regarding that security situation. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're also going to talk about a new law in the UK called the PSTI, the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act. Boy, that's a mouthful. So some cool stuff there, and we're also going to touch base, a bit of a short update on the Change Healthcare situation. So we've got a lot to talk about, Eric. I guess before we get any further, for those folks that may not know who you are, can you give us a short introduction of yourself, my friend?
Sure. I'm Eric Siron. I recognize as a Microsoft most valuable professional in the cloud and data center management category. I have been in IT since the late 90s, and I prefer to work with smaller organizations, mainly because I feel like they don't get the representation in the tech world that they should. But I also work with a number of larger names, too.
Definitely. And you do a lot in the healthcare IT space as well, too. So
currently, yes.
When it comes to things like the Change Healthcare situation, I always love to get your opinion, because you're much closer to the healthcare IT these days than I am. So anyway, well, what do you think? Should we start with our data points, Eric?
Let's go through them. So
in this episode every month, we used to go through the data points point by point, but I found it works better if I go through, like the four main data points first, and then we discuss them afterwards. So that's what I'm going to do on this particular episode. So the first thing we look at every month is what is the breakdown between the percentage of clean emails versus threats versus advanced threats versus rejected, spam, right? All those different classifications. And the story that our data paints this month, right, is that the amount of email threats is generally down for the month. So we actually saw a 3.5 percentage point increase in the amount of clean emails throughout the data period. And that said, we saw a slight increase in the amount of emails that were categorized as threats, very slight, and also a slight increase in the amount of advanced threats. Again, very slight there, but by and large, overall threats are down. That said, businesses need to remain vigilant, right? In terms of file types used in email attacks, we always look at what file types are used for the delivery of malicious payloads. Think things like malicious attachments. By and large, PDF was the biggest offender during this data period. No surprises there, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. We also saw a slight increase in the use of malicious Excel documents, which is kind of surprising. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We always look at the most top targeted industries. So we have a metric that we track called the industry threat index. If you want to figure out how all the maths and things like that, you can take a look at the written report. But basically, it's a metric that allows us to see which industry verticals are being targeted more than others. We found that this month, the mining, media, and hospitality industries were the most top targeted verticals. And then in terms of statistics, the last item that I wanted to mention, we also look at most impersonated brands. And for this particular month, we saw a very large impersonation campaign against a German financial entity called Commerzbank. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Commerce with a Z, Commerzbank. So very large impersonation campaign against that entity. And then we have our usual offenders also at the top of the list. We have FedEx, DHL, and Facebook in a close fourth place. So again, I'm speaking in generalities here. If you want to look at the exact data, be sure to check out the show notes where I will have a link to the written report where you can get all those nitty-gritty details. But Eric, is there anything here that stands out to you right out of the get-go that you want to talk about, or should we go through it line by line here?
Well, that part fortunately feels like a very relaxing month, more or less. Like we're doing well, and I'm hoping, and I would assume some of the fall off as the holidays are winding down and wound out.
It's interesting you mentioned that, and I've been doing these reports long enough now to where I've got some length of time where I can objectively look at the data now, right? And we see the same behavior almost year after year. And I remember last year about the same time, you start seeing the amount of email threats die off a little bit because threat actors know that, okay, we're starting to get towards some of the summer months, and they know that there's not as many butts in seats inside of businesses around the world, and therefore you don't see as much threatening email traffic. The other interesting drop-off here is, or as part of that, the other drop-off that we perceive as part of that is tax season in the U.S., and I think other countries just got over with. So over the last month or two, we've seen an increase in brand impersonations. I know I didn't mention it here, but I know even this month there was a slight increase in the amount of DocuSign brand impersonation emails. And so that's common to see around the March, April timeframe because threat actors know that people are likely to see those types of emails sitting in their inboxes, right? So I think part of that drop-off can be attributed to, hey, tax season is over now. Thank God. So, any thoughts on that point, Eric?
Oh, I just find it interesting. There's a push-pull relationship because, like, for me, the way all my taxes tend to work out, like if you had broken into my account in the month before taxes, you would have been a happy person, relatively speaking. If you broke into it after tax day, not so much. So impersonating breaking into my account, but other people are going to have probably opposite stories, I guess. So it seems it's a good way to get into your financial stream, I guess. But when those taxes come out, man,
it can be painful. That's
okay,
for sure.
Great. You stole all $10 in my account. Good for you.
Good old Uncle Sam is going to get paid, right?
Yes,
no matter what.
He is.
Anyway, the other thing I want to make sure we touch on, I mentioned the malicious attachments, right? So, I mean, it's no surprise that PDFs are at the top of the list. We've talked about this on the show before, so I'm not going to dive into that super deep. But basically, it boils down to PDFs are kind of a universal format. They can be opened on multiple different operating systems and platforms. So it makes them popular for the delivery of malicious payloads. We also see archive files up in the list quite frequently as well as HTML for much the same reason, right? I can open an HTML file on Linux, Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, whatever, right? Now, the interesting one here to me, and it wasn't a huge increase, but it was a noticeable increase in the usage of malicious Excel documents. Now, if you recall, I want to say it was a year plus ago. Don't quote me on the exact date. Microsoft at one point in time made the really good decision, in my opinion, to disable macros in Office documents by default. It became the new default. If I go back and look at our data on this data point from back then, there was a monumental drop off at that stage in the use of malicious Office documents. Now, that said, occasionally we see a slight uptick in either malicious Excel or Word documents. And because even though that default rule is still in place, threat actors have found some very how do I want to put it? I don't want to say ingenious because that feels like giving them too much credit, but interesting workarounds to that problem. So you've probably seen them, Eric, but I've seen malicious Excel documents where the threat actor will format them in such a way that it appears that you're getting that stereotypical like drop down message underneath the ribbon, and they format the cells in Excel to look like it's that official Office message, and it says, oh, in order to get the full functionality of this document, please copy this file to C program files, Office, whatever the path is. Mm-hmm. And they want you ultimately to put it into the templates folder, which those macros are allowed to run if it's in the templates folder. So they're trying to trick the user into some sort of manual process to get around that issue and allow those malicious macros to execute, right?
I was thinking of another way, and okay, I'm gonna be very specific here in that I fully believe, regardless of the crime, regardless of what the victim did, the crime is always the fault of the perpetrator, period, end of story. So I don't want to put too much blame on Microsoft here, but I think they have been enabling the bad guys a little bit, because every time I open an Office app for the last 6 months, at least 3 pop-ups. Do this, do that, look here, do that.
Very true.
How hard is it for these guys to go in here and just put another pop-up in, click here, and that click here thing you click on is enable? Is it something? I don't even know if it's a thing that they can do, but we have all got this. And I tell you, there must be kids working at Microsoft now, because all of us who lived through the 90s are like, we remember the pop-up days. Don't bring those back.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the 90s called and said, no, we don't want them back either. Just stop with the pop-ups. So these folks now are like, well, they didn't grow up with pop-ups. They're not used to it. So they're like, oh, just put pop-ups everywhere. It'll be great. Like, no, it's horrible. Stop that. And if your attackers are like, I know how to piggyback that and have it, and like you just said, trick them into clicking that enable button because they've got fatigue from, I don't care, I don't want to see this, leave me alone, stop. Yes,
that is very true. And so in this particular case, like you said, I'm not familiar enough with the underlying workings of Word to know if there's a way that they could tap into the actual control mechanisms of Office itself to bring up a pop-up box. But from what I've seen, they're just formatting the document so that it looks like one of those.
Couldn't you put a picture of that in there that it looks like that pop-up?
Yeah, I could
right
see
underneath
that.
It. Yep. Here, look, we have this great new feature where you turn everything on and the space shuttle will launch. And like, fine, do it, launch the space shuttle, and then all of a sudden you've run their macro.
And it's funny, this particular talking point ties into something that Paul Schneckenberger, our friend Paul, and I have talked about on the show before regarding 2 points. One around QR codes and another around OAuth applications. So we have kind of inadvertently taught users to either scan a QR code or hit accept on the OAuth window. That OAuth window that says, hey, this app is trying to access your account. It needs access to A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. We've kind of taught users to either scan the QR code or hit accept in order to get their work done, right? Yeah. So it's kind of the same psychology behind that, right? Yeah. And it's comes back to user training. Ultimately, we have to fix those bad habits, right?
I agree. It is a lot of that, but it's also, again, you can't train me enough, especially like with my particular mental conditions. If I get tired of seeing the same crap over and over, eventually I'm just going to stop reading them. Right. And in the case of like these pop-ups, okay, got it, cool, go away now.
Right.
I could see myself falling victim to one of those. Other than I'm just like naturally extra untrustworthy when I get an attachment, but
Right. Yeah, it's
we can't punt
too
this
many
one too much onto
pop-ups.
the users. User training can only go so far, even with people.
That's very true. Very true. Agreed. Agreed. All right. Well, speaking of Microsoft, I think that's a nice segue into our first major news story of this month's report, right? And I kind of mentioned it in the intro, right? So Microsoft has had a whole litany of security issues over the last couple of years. I've already mentioned the Midnight Blizzard situation. The Storm 0558 issue is probably the biggest one, and this is the situation where, in this case, Chinese nation-state threat actors were able to, and this is a running joke that Paul and I have, they were able to purloin a consumer signing key. What did I used to say? They procured, and Paul made the point that, okay, if they procured it, it means they legitimately bought it.
It certainly
So,
implies a legitimate process was involved, yes. But
right,
purloined, I
so
like that
they
word.
purloined a Microsoft consumer signing key, and the attack worked. They were able to use that signing key to forge authentication tokens into Azure Entra and therefore make inroads into Microsoft Cloud services. Now, this was obviously a bad one, and it was made worse by the fact that it was not Microsoft themselves that discovered this attack. It was the U.S. State Department, as they were one of the victims of said attack. Now,
Ouch.
as a result of that, the U.S. Cyber Safety Review Board, CSRB, issued a, how do I want to put it, very strongly worded, not good for Microsoft style report about the incident. In short, they basically said this attack was preventable and should not have happened. Now, if you're interested in the findings of that report, Paul, and I mentioned Paul a couple of times already in this episode, Paul and I did a 2-part podcast episode on the findings of that report. So be sure to check those out. I'll link those in the show notes in case you're interested in that. Now, one of the things that Paul and I have said about all of these security incidents at Microsoft lately is like, okay, there have been multiple incidents lately. Trust is starting to be eroded, for Microsoft's customers. Where's Satya? Where's the CEO? It's gotten to the point to where there needs to be some indication from senior leadership at Microsoft that these security issues are being taken seriously. Now, if you think back to, I think it was November, Microsoft Ignite, they came out with the SFI, the Secure Future Initiative, which some people likened to the Trustworthy Computing memo that Bill Gates famously released. I think it was 2002, if I remember right. Paul and I also did a podcast episode where we kind of dug into the Secure Future Initiative. I'll put those in the show notes as well too. But basically, we found that the Secure Future Initiative, while it all sounds well and good, did not have kind of the heft and the teeth to it that the Trustworthy Computing Initiative had. Now, that said, it recently came out in the news a week or two back that it was in a Microsoft earnings call. We finally got word from Satya Nadella himself that the security issues at Microsoft are becoming the first priority, and they have committed to working on the security issues before any new products and features are worked on, which fantastic news, in my opinion. I think that's what they need to do. They need to not only get their house in order, but they need to put people's minds at rest too. That's like, hey, we are not going to have tunnel vision on AI and all things Copilot and forget all the security stuff that's going on, right? And so good news in that regard, and that it's coming from the CEO, which means there's weight to the initiative, and hopefully the people from the top down all have the mandate in order to get this done. And so that's my 2 cents on this particular point. I want to let you get a word in on this one, Eric.
Yeah, I am. So, from a business owner perspective, I would be in a don't tell me, show me place. Cool.
Right.
Anybody can write a memo. Security is very important to me. Yeah. I will tell you that before that I heard this from what you had just relayed to everybody, Mark Rasinovich, who is currently the CTO of Azure, and everybody watching,
Right.
if you don't know who Mark Rasinovich is, you need to go find out. He's a very important figure
For sure.
our industry and has been for decades. He has said that they are now starting initiatives to stop, or not, I don't know about stop necessarily, but start moving development over to Rust.
Okay.
And I'm of two minds on this. C++ has been my favorite language for a very long time, and I agree with a lot of the complaints, but I also think some of them are overstated. And like you'll read articles that say, "Oh yeah, look, this big project was coded in C/C++, so we got to get off of those." What was the Heartbleed one? Was one of the examples I saw used. Well,
Okay.
my complaint is and will always be that people are using C/C++ as though those are interchangeable terms, and they're not.
Right.
OpenSSL is written in C, not C++. You can't do anything about pointers, bare native pointers in C because that's all it's got. C++ has had mechanisms to deal with that since 2011. And it's nobody's fault these days on new code if they're not taking advantage of it, except that person, right? So
Right.
I'm not going to jump up and down about, oh, we got to get off C++ yesterday because it's insecure. It's like, well, that means you're doing it wrong. Sorry. I mean, maybe
Right.
I try to be very careful about throwing around the phrase you're doing it wrong, but if you're writing C++ as though it was C, you're doing it wrong. And a lot of Microsoft's original code base is also C. The
Right.
interfaces
Yep.
are C. There are things like that. So, my first reaction to get a little bit like, I'm not, you know what, I'm in a place I don't want to learn any more languages. So, and I looked at Rust and, fine, great, cool, but I don't want to. So that was kind of my reaction. But after, okay, all the opinion piece out of the way though, the point of Rust is that it doesn't have, I think it doesn't have like native pointers exposed to where you have to use them. Like you can, by default, just coding normally is more like using a like .NET or something that has that layer where it abstracts away most of the memory stuff, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But you get the native performance of like C or C++. So that's my understanding of it. So regardless of how you feel about the languages or whatever, so put my opinion away, someone brand new starting out in Rust, writing Rust the way the language is intended, is going to write more secure code by default.
Right.
Right. Now, again, there's a whole lot of stars and asterisks and caveats, and I'd be really careful about trying to quote that out of context. But this does show that operationally, we see that they're like, oh, okay, we need to think about this. And whether you agree with the decisions they're making or not, okay, fine. But I think that is moving that part there, and I saw it first. So if somebody said, yeah, don't tell me, show me, it's like, well, here, I have something to show you. So,
Right.
yeah.
Right. And see, I think I'm of a mind to where normally I would agree with that. Again, if I was putting myself in the CEO's chair, I think when I'm an organization as large as Microsoft, and I think the other interesting thing about the CSRB's report is they kind of almost took a stance and admitted that the government, right, because it's a government entity, sees public cloud as quote unquote critical infrastructure, right? And so if I'm Microsoft and I'm deemed to be critical infrastructure, and I've had all these security issues, I think I would adopt that don't, like, you guys take care of it type of response, right? But I just feel like as many as there have been, in my opinion, I feel like it got to a point where it needed some sort of message, some sort of acknowledgement needed to come from senior leadership, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's good that it seems to be happening at multiple tiers within the organization now, right? Not only from the CEO themselves, but you mentioned Mark, and there have been a number of different points now. So we're seeing action at all tiers of the organization, which I think is a net positive, given the situation, right?
Yes. And that would be
So,
the big takeaway from that is if you look beyond Satya, you can see evidence of what he's saying. It's not just,
yep,
oh yeah, well, here's your platitude. So that's good. I mean, that's
yep,
definitely a good thing.
for sure. Well, we've got two other news stories to cover in the time we've got left. I want to spend some time talking about a new law in the UK. And I mentioned it in the intro a little bit. The PSTI, the Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Act. And this one kind of floated under the radar for a lot of people, I think. And so basically, what this act is, and it's not a law that is just being talked about. Like, it is law. It has passed. It is effective. Don't quote me on this. I believe the effective date was April 29th, 2024. So it's already in effect. Now, essentially what this law does, it's kind of the first law of its kind that I'm aware of. This law targets consumer level devices and IoT, consumer level IoT devices as well too. So I'm just thinking about like the stuff in my house, like I have a smart enabled washing machine. If I wanted to use it, it's not even connected to the network, because why do I need a smart enabled washing machine? Anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Smart refrigerators. I use Hue smart lighting in the house. So every light bulb is a smart device, right? That type of
Right.
thing. So this law is targeting those types of devices. And what's so interesting about this particular law for me is that it sets out to solve a big problem that has existed in that space since the dawn of time, right? How many, I'm going to pick on cable modems and or routers to begin with, consumer routers, right? How many times do you put one of those devices in place and the username and password are both admin, or username admin, password password? Well, that's one of the core things that this particular law addresses. Now, it addresses a number of different things. I think there are 14, 15, 16 different provisions in here, but the three big ones that this law specifically focuses on, according to their website, which I've got, if you want to link to the actual document, check out the written report. I got a link in there. But it states that passwords must be unique per product or capable of being defined by the user of the product, right? So that's the first provision, the first requirement. It also has to provide information on how to report security issues. So there has to be a mechanism, some way for the consumer of that product to contact the manufacturer and say, hey, there's a security problem here. You guys need to fix it. And they also need to provide information on the minimum security update period. So basically, this device you just bought, how long is it going to receive security updates, right? So with certain IoT devices, you hear in the news all the time about, like people buy an IoT device and it's already end of life, or it never receives an update ever again, right? That type of thing. And so on the surface, a lot of people have been looking at this law, and kind of the initial knee-jerk reaction was like, well, it's a UK law, right? It's, it only takes effect in the UK. Not exactly. So what's interesting about this is the law impacts any company that does business in the UK. So if I'm a US manufacturer of home networking equipment and I sell in the UK, well, now I have to worry about this, right? And the other good thing, in my opinion, is that this thing has teeth as well. So any organization that is deemed to not be in compliance with this law will face a fine of 10 million British pounds, or 4% of worldwide revenue, whichever is highest. And so, personally, myself, I think this is a net positive for the industry, because we have seen time and time again where device manufacturers, for whatever reason, have to be made to follow security best practices. And when I think about the target users of these devices, usually you have Sally at home. She buys a router and just wants to get on the internet, right? She doesn't care what the password is or even knows about security best practices, right? So this law is kind of, kind of making those manufacturers build the device in a way that Sally is protected, but she doesn't necessarily need to know how she's protected, right? So anyway, I've done a lot of talking on this point, Eric. What do you think?
I am in love with this, and especially I think it's going to have some unforeseen consequences.
Oh,
But
for sure.
but
Yeah.
you did a great job of really pulling out IoT, because I know a lot of people, security, like faces, names, people that, if you follow any of that, you recognize, who are like flat out like, I will not have a lock on my door with any sort of electronic gadgetry in it, because all of it is so horrifically insecure.
Yep.
So you were commenting on how like a lot of them can't enforce them. Like some of these vendors are in verticals where they should just know you got to do
Yep.
security stuff. Like you're putting a lock on a door, you are in security guy. So you
Yup.
know, because like light bulbs and things, I can kind of see where they would get a little bit lax with it. Like, okay, what's the worst you can do? You're going to flash somebody's lights, and I don't know. Maybe it could cause a seizure. I don't know, and I'm not really sure where you'd go with that, but. I've seen videos of people, walking down the street, unlocking doors, opening garage doors,
Yeah.
right? Because they've broken, because the IoT stuff is exactly the way you were describing it. So I really love it for that. I do have some questions that I think will be answered as time goes on and this gets tested in court. But overall, I love where this is going. This is going to benefit everyone, and it's going to probably do
Right.
it pretty fast. You've probably got a lot of legal teams and a lot of big corporations right now who are, how do we get in compliance yesterday? We don't want to 4% of annual revenue. That's going to hurt. So,
Yeah, I mean, depending on the organization, 4% of annual revenue is, and that's the thing, 4% of annual worldwide revenue.
and
It's
revenue, not profit. It's revenue. So you can't you
Yeah.
can't legally hide that number
Yup.
or fudge it. Revenue is
Yup.
revenue. So, yeah,
So that could be painful for somebody on the receiving end of that. So,
yeah,
but yeah, I mean, I've long said that as an industry, as a society, we have been fast approaching a point where the governments of the world are starting to lose patience with all of these security incidents and breaches. And eventually, I think Australia was the first to do it. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but create legislation regarding security best practices and put real teeth
yeah,
on the law, right? And so I mentioned Australia. They came up with a law a year or two back regarding, if I remember correctly, negligence in terms of data breaches, right? If the organization having been breached was found to be negligent in their security posture, the fines were huge, massive, massive fines. And so I think that type of legislation is needed to, again, unfortunately, force these organizations to do what they should have been doing all along, right?
yeah. Because a lot of them are
So,
hiding behind, well, I'm not the bad guy here, so. But
yep.
okay, yes, you're not the bad guy, but I mean you're the good guy either.
Right. So, anyway.
Because the victims are the customers of that company, not the company itself.
Right,
That's the
exactly.
mentality, and so
Exactly. Well, the last item on the list for the day, Eric, is an update on the Change Healthcare situation. So, if you are frequent watchers of this show, you've heard us talk about this particular issue before. Eric, I think it was you and I talked about this. I want to say it was a month or two back, if I remember correctly. Anyway, this is the attack where Change Healthcare, which is a subsidiary of Optum, if I remember correctly. I knew the last time we talked about that. I've since forgotten. But anyway, Change Healthcare is an organization that is heavily involved in the U.S. healthcare industry. They handle insurance payments for healthcare practices, and they have a huge hand in making sure that end patients get their medications via pharmacies across the country, right? And so Change Healthcare was impacted by a rather large-scale ransomware attack by a threat actor group known as Black Cat. And they basically ransomware the organization. And because of Change Healthcare's massive market share in what they do, which that's a whole different talking point we'll have to get into later, how it got to this point. But because of their massive market share, this impacted people nationwide here in the U.S. In terms of getting their medication, getting, if you were a doctor's office, getting your insurance payments so that you could keep your doors open, that type of thing. It really had a major impact. And so it led to a situation where you've got diabetes patients not able to get their insulin medication because their insurance payments can't be processed and things like that. And so I think, Eric, we talked about last time how there is a very human element, a very human cost to this attack, right?
Yeah.
And that's important because of this next point. Now, it was always suspected that they had paid a ransom because those blockchain experts out in the industry, they were able to tell that, okay, these blockchain addresses that are known to be associated with this threat actor group received a very large payment, right? So it was always assumed that they had paid a ransom, but they have officially come out and stated that, yeah, we paid a $22 million ransom, which, I don't know, I'd have to go look. That might be the largest. Is that the largest in history? I probably should have looked before I got on the show. It's got to be close if it's not, right? And so it brings up the question of, if you're ransomware, do you pay the ransom or not? Now, I guess I'll start with my opinion on this, Eric, before I hand things over to you. I've always been a staunch opponent of paying the ransom because it just further enables the threat actor group, right? Like, you're giving them what they want to continue their operations. So I feel like you're just encouraging the behavior if you're going to pay the ransom, right? Now, I have some sensitivity in this particular case because I can only imagine what the boardrooms and the incident response rooms were like over at Change Healthcare during the situation, because you've got this massive market share in the healthcare space. You've got end patients not getting medications because you're down. You got to be staring down the barrel of multiple class action lawsuits. I can only imagine the amount of pressure that creates, that like, okay, we need to do whatever we can to get this thing back up and working again, right? So part of me can't fault them for paying the ransom because of that. I don't like it, but I understand it, right? And I mean, I think that's where I'm at with it. But what are your thoughts before we talk a little bit more about the threat actor group?
Well, the simplest part is, anytime you have things like this that are complicated, you can have an abstract approach. And the abstract approach is to say, in a situation where I know nothing, my default answer is don't pay the ransom for the reasons you said, and we could go on and on and on. I think overwhelmingly it leans toward don't pay the ransom. But again, that's the abstract. Whenever you get into a specific situation like this where you have then you got to start taking the other things into account. And at that point, it kind of becomes a cost-benefit analysis. And in this case, they probably made the right choice.
Right.
So I'm glad I didn't have to deal with it. Let me put it that way. I do not envy
you
any
and me
person.
both. I can't imagine having to be on the team dealing with that. And I mean, I guess the other part of it is, if you look at this, the damage done in two ways. One, you have the downtime. The service is not available. People are not getting their medications, which is horrible all by itself. Mm-hmm. But then you've got the risk to PHI, right? The protected health information. So we've seen a trend in the industry now over the last couple of years where threat actors have gotten wise in their ransomware efforts that, okay, hey, the primary method of coming back from a ransomware attack is to restore from backup, right? So now we've seen this increase in, essentially double extortion schemes is what it comes down to, right? They'll ransomware the data, but they'll also exfil it so that if, the company recovers from backup, the threat actor can still be like, hey, I've got your data. You're still going to pay me the ransom or else I'm going to leak it to the public, right? So in this case, it's been verified that the threat actor, again, Black Cat, exfilled the data. And so, yes, the service, Change Healthcare, is back up and running today. It's working, but that data is out there. And if you look at the article I linked inside of the written report, you'll find that there was evidence that the data was available for purchase out on the dark web, and allegedly has since been taken down after the $22 million ransom was paid. But who's to say they don't turn around tomorrow and put it back up there, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you can't definitively say that, okay, because we paid the ransom, the data is safe.
Right.
It's not safe, right? And
this
plus,
is the age-old story of blackmail. That's nothing new about what's going on here in those terms.
Exactly. And I mean, it's complicated by the fact that it wasn't just Black Cat involved in this. There's all this drama on the threat actor side too, where an affiliate brought the attack to Black Cat, which executed it. The affiliate was supposed to get a cut, but Black Cat took the 22 million and ran, basically. And allegedly, the affiliate also had a copy of the data. So I could see the affiliate being angry and just releasing the data anyway, right? So I mean, the data's out there, no matter which way you spin it, right?
Yeah, it's been exfiltrated, so unfortunately, the company and all of its customers need to just assume their data is compromised and just.
Yep.
Yeah, I think in their case, the point of paying it would have been to end the downtime.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
Fiscal cost would have been insane on that, and that's before you even start calculating the value of the human lives impacted. So.
And that's the thing I keep coming back to with this particular attack is, I mean, this attack, if it hasn't already, could have led to people dying,
Yes, and even if it didn't, it is certainly going to have impacted people's long-term health situations. I guarantee it has done that.
For sure. Yep. I know family members that could not get medications filled because insurance processing couldn't happen, right? So then they were looking at having to pay out of pocket for a given medication that, without insurance, the cost is by orders of magnitude much more expensive without insurance.
Yep.
So.
And if you're lucky, sometimes you'll find a pharmacy that'll figure something out, whatever. Sometimes. But a lot of people, you're just going to go, wait, sorry, we can't do that. Bye. And I guarantee people were hurt by this, and it'll be like years. This is going to ripple through the years for some people.
For sure.
And it's
certainly,
really horrible.
For sure. And it certainly has, in my opinion, brought to light the fact of how brittle that portion of the U.S. healthcare infrastructure is.
So much brittleness across so many things. There are certain things that you just probably don't want to know about the world that you live in.
Probably not.
But it really comes back to, I think a lot of people are kind of surprised, who would do that? Who has such low regard for the value of human life that they would do something like this? And I think they kind of live in this world of, it could happen, but is really anybody that evil? Well, yeah, actually people are that evil. They don't care.
Sure are.
$22 million payday. Who cares if I kill, a few million people? So what? Something that you and I would never do, but then again, you and I aren't criminals. We're not killers. We're not trying to, we have to, evil is out there and it's real, and they just proved
Maybe it's just because I played D&D last weekend, but I like to say chaotic evil does exist in the world. So there's my nerdy moment for the show. Of course, we're on a podcast about security and cybersecurity, so I mean it's kind of nerdy to begin with.
I'm sure almost everybody understands the chaotic evil reference. I'm sure.
We all wear it as a badge of honor, and not chaotic evil, the nerdiness label, right? So anyway. Well, Eric, I want to thank you for spending some time and talking to us today. It's always good talking to you, my friend.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Definitely. And those of you watching, thanks for spending some time with us. If you found value in today's show, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Otherwise, you can catch us on all the major podcasting platforms, so chances are you can find us wherever you consume your content. If you're interested in more about Hornet Security, you can go out to hornetsecurity.com for more information there. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Again, thanks for spending some time with us and hanging out. Catch you next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Stay safe out there.